The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Stanford University basement as 24 college students prepared for what they believed would be a simple 2-week experiment about prison life. None of them could have imagined that within days, this controlled environment would transform ordinary young men into brutal guards and broken prisoners. What Dr. Philip Zimbardo witnessed in August 1971 would forever change our understanding of human nature and reveal a terrifying truth: evil doesn't require monsters. It only needs the right circumstances to bloom in the most ordinary of people. The Stanford prison experiment, as it came to be known, lasted only 6 days before Zimbardo was forced to terminate it. What began as an academic study devolved into psychological torture, sexual humiliation, and genuine mental breakdowns. The guards had become sadistic, the prisoners had become genuinely traumatized, and the line between role-playing and reality had dissolved entirely. But, perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that these weren't inherently evil people. They were honor students, athletes, young men from good families who had undergone extensive psychological screening to ensure they were mentally healthy and stable. This transformation from good to evil in the span of mere hours represents what Zimbardo would later term the Lucifer effect, the process by which ordinary individuals become capable of extraordinary evil. Named after the biblical angel who fell from grace to become Satan, the Lucifer effect challenges our most fundamental assumptions about human nature. We prefer to believe that evil is the domain of bad people, psychopaths, criminals, those fundamentally different from ourselves. This belief system, while comforting, is dangerously naive. The reality is that each human being carries within themselves the capacity for both tremendous good and unspeakable evil. The difference between a hero and a villain often comes down to circumstances, social pressure, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. This isn't a pessimistic view of humanity, it's a realistic one that acknowledges the full spectrum of human potential while recognizing the critical importance of the choices we make and the environments we create. Consider the case of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a group of middle-aged German men from Hamburg who became some of the most efficient killers in Nazi-occupied Poland. These weren't SS fanatics or hardened soldiers. They were family men in their 30s and 40s, policemen, teachers, clerks, and small business owners who had lived ordinary lives until they found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Over the course of several months in 1942 and 1943, these ordinary men, as historian Christopher Browning called them, participated in the systematic murder of at least 83,000 Jews. What makes their story particularly chilling is that they were given a choice. On their first day of mass killing operations, their commanding officer made it clear that any man who felt unable to participate could step aside without facing court-martial or punishment. Out of nearly 500 men, fewer than a dozen took this option. The rest proceeded to execute women, children, and elderly people at point-blank range, many becoming violently ill but continuing nonetheless. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small compromises, following orders that seemed distasteful but not catastrophic, accepting the dehumanizing language used to describe their victims, and gradually becoming desensitized to violence through repeated exposure. Each step made the next one easier, until men who had once been horrified by the thought of killing innocent people were competing to see who could murder more efficiently. This gradual descent into evil follows a predictable pattern that researchers have identified across cultures and throughout history. It begins with the creation of an us versus them mentality, where the targets of violence are portrayed as fundamentally different, dangerous, or less than human. This dehumanization is crucial because it's much harder to harm someone you see as fully human and deserving of moral consideration. The process continues with the diffusion of responsibility, where individual moral agency is surrendered to authority figures or group consensus. When everyone is following orders or participating in collective action, no single person feels fully responsible for the consequences. This diffusion is often accompanied by the gradual escalation of harmful behaviors, where each new transgression is only slightly worse than the last, making it psychologically easier to justify. Environmental factors play a crucial role in this transformation. Situations that promote anonymity, reduce individual accountability, create time pressure, or establish clear hierarchies all increase the likelihood that ordinary people will engage in harmful behavior. The physical environment itself can influence moral decision-making. Research has shown that people are more likely to act aggressively in hot, crowded, or noisy conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the transformation from good to evil often involves the gradual erosion of what psychologists call moral disengagement. This is the process by which people convince themselves that their harmful actions are justified, necessary, or not really that harmful at all. They might tell themselves that their victims deserved it, that they were just following orders, that everyone else was doing it, or that no real harm was being done. The power of social roles cannot be underestimated in this process. When people are assigned specific roles, whether as guards, soldiers, or authority figures, they often internalize the expectations and behaviors associated with those roles, even when those behaviors conflict with their personal values. The Stanford prison experiment demonstrated this with startling clarity, as young men who had never shown any tendency toward cruelty quickly adopted the brutal behaviors they associated with being prison guards. But, perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Lucifer effect is how it operates below the level of conscious awareness. Most people who engage in harmful behavior don't wake up one morning and decide to become evil. Instead, they make a series of small compromises, each of which seems reasonable in the moment, until they find themselves in a place they never imagined they would be. This unconscious nature of moral transformation makes it particularly dangerous because it bypasses our rational defenses. We like to think that we would recognize evil when we see it and have the courage to resist it, but research consistently shows that most people fail to recognize the gradual erosion of their moral boundaries until it's too late. The implications of this research extend far beyond academic psychology. Understanding how ordinary people become capable of evil is crucial for preventing genocide, terrorism, corruption, and other forms of systematic wrongdoing. It's also essential for understanding how we can create environments and institutions that promote moral behavior rather than undermine it. In the corporate world, we see examples of the Lucifer effect in accounting scandals, where employees gradually compromise their professional ethics to meet unrealistic targets or please demanding supervisors. In the military, it manifests in war crimes committed by soldiers who entered service with strong moral convictions but found themselves in situations that gradually eroded their moral restraints. The digital age has created new opportunities for the Lucifer effect to operate. Online harassment, cyberbullying, and the spread of hate speech are often perpetrated by people who would never engage in such behavior face-to-face. The anonymity and distance provided by digital communication can reduce empathy and moral inhibition, making it easier for ordinary people to cause real harm to others. Social media platforms, in particular, create environments that can promote moral disengagement. The design of these platforms often emphasizes quick, emotional responses rather than thoughtful consideration, and the algorithms that determine what content we see can create echo chambers that reinforce extreme views and dehumanize those who disagree with us. Understanding the Lucifer effect doesn't mean accepting that humans are inherently evil or that moral behavior is impossible. Instead, it means recognizing that goodness and evil are not fixed character traits but rather emerge from the interaction between individual psychology and environmental factors. This understanding empowers us to create conditions that promote moral behavior and to recognize and resist the forces that can lead us toward harmful actions. The key insight from research on the Lucifer effect is that preventing evil requires more than just hoping that people will make good choices. It requires creating systems, institutions, and cultures that make good choices easier and bad choices harder. This might involve establishing clear ethical guidelines, creating accountability mechanisms, promoting diversity of thought, and designing decision-making processes that slow down and encourage reflection rather than quick, emotional responses. Individual awareness is also crucial. By understanding the psychological mechanisms that can lead to moral failure, people can be better prepared to recognize and resist these influences in their own lives. This includes being aware of the tendency to rationalize harmful behavior, the pressure to conform to group expectations, and the gradual nature of moral erosion. The Stanford prison experiment and similar research have shown us that the line between good and evil is much thinner than we would like to believe. But this knowledge, rather than being cause for despair, can be the foundation for building a more moral world. By understanding how ordinary people become capable of evil, we can work to ensure that they become capable of extraordinary good instead. Part 2. The architecture of moral collapse. The human mind possesses a remarkable capacity for self-deception, particularly when it comes to justifying behaviors that contradict our moral beliefs. This psychological flexibility, while sometimes adaptive, becomes dangerous when it allows us to rationalize increasingly harmful actions without conscious recognition of our moral drift. The process by which good people do bad things is not a sudden transformation but, rather, a gradual erosion of ethical boundaries, built on a foundation of small compromises and self-serving interpretations of ambiguous situations. At the heart of this moral collapse lies a sophisticated psychological defense system that protects our self-image as good people even as our actions suggest otherwise. Albert Bandura, one of psychology's most influential researchers, identified several mechanisms of moral disengagement that allow people to avoid the guilt and self-condemnation that would normally result from harmful behavior. These mechanisms operate largely below conscious awareness, making them particularly effective at preserving our positive self-concept while we engage in increasingly problematic actions. The first mechanism is moral justification, where harmful acts are made to seem worthy by portraying them as serving a higher purpose. The Crusades were justified as serving God, slavery was rationalized as bringing civilization to primitive peoples, and modern terrorists convince themselves they are fighting for justice or freedom. In the corporate world, executives might justify laying off thousands of workers as necessary for shareholder value or competitiveness, transforming human suffering into a moral imperative. This process of moral justification is often supported by euphemistic labeling, where harmful actions are given sanitized or even positive names that obscure their true nature. Military forces don't kill civilians, they produce collateral damage. Companies don't fire employees, they right-size or optimize human resources. Governments don't torture prisoners, they use enhanced interrogation techniques. These linguistic gymnastics serve to distance the actor from the moral reality of their actions. The power of euphemistic language extends beyond merely hiding the truth from others, it actually changes how the actors themselves perceive their behavior. When harmful actions are consistently described in neutral or positive terms, it becomes easier to see them as acceptable or even praiseworthy. The language we use doesn't just describe reality, it shapes our perception of it. Advantageous comparison represents another crucial mechanism of moral disengagement. This involves making harmful behavior seem less serious by comparing it to even worse actions. A person might justify cheating on their taxes by pointing out that others steal cars, or a nation might rationalize human rights violations by noting that other countries are worse. This comparative morality allows people to maintain their sense of being fundamentally good while engaging in clearly harmful behavior. The displacement and diffusion of responsibility are particularly powerful mechanisms in organizational and group settings. When harmful decisions are made collectively or under orders from authority figures, individuals can convince themselves that they are not truly responsible for the consequences. This diffusion of responsibility was clearly evident in the Holocaust, where thousands of people participated in genocide while maintaining that they were just following orders or that their individual contribution was insignificant. Modern organizational structures often facilitate this diffusion of responsibility through complex chains of command and specialized roles that fragment decision-making processes. A bank executive might approve policies that lead to predatory lending practices while feeling personally removed from the families who lose their homes as a result. Each person in the chain can point to others as being more responsible, creating a system where everyone is complicit but no one feels truly accountable. The displacement of responsibility onto authority figures is particularly insidious because it allows people to maintain their moral self-image while abdicating their moral agency. Research consistently shows that most people will engage in harmful behavior when instructed to do so by legitimate authority figures, even when that behavior clearly violates their personal moral standards. The famous Milgram experiments demonstrated this with shocking clarity, showing that ordinary people would administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to innocent victims simply because a scientist in a lab coat told them it was necessary for research. Distortion of consequences represents another mechanism by which people avoid confronting the harm their actions cause. This can involve minimizing the severity of harm, denying that harm occurred, or simply avoiding information about the consequences of one's actions. Corporate executives might focus on quarterly profit reports while avoiding news stories about the environmental damage their companies cause. Military leaders might emphasize strategic objectives while downplaying civilian casualties. The digital age has made this distortion of consequences easier than ever before. When harmful actions can be carried out remotely through computer interfaces, the psychological distance between action and consequence increases dramatically. A drone operator can cause massive destruction while sitting in an air-conditioned trailer thousands of miles away, insulated from the human reality of their actions by technology and bureaucratic procedures. Dehumanization of victims is perhaps the most crucial mechanism for enabling extreme evil. When potential victims are seen as less than fully human, the normal moral restraints against harming others are weakened or eliminated entirely. This dehumanization can be explicit, as in Nazi propaganda that portrayed Jews as vermin, or subtle, as in corporate cultures that refer to customers as marks or targets. The process of dehumanization often begins with language that emphasizes differences between groups and gradually escalates to deny the basic humanity of the target group. Social media has accelerated this process by creating echo chambers where extreme views can be reinforced and radicalized without exposure to opposing perspectives or humanizing information about targeted groups. Attribution of blame to victims allows perpetrators to convince themselves that their targets deserved whatever harm befell them. This mechanism is evident in cases of sexual assault where victims are blamed for their clothing or behavior, in corporate fraud where customers are blamed for being naive enough to trust the company, and in international conflicts where civilian casualties are blamed on the enemy for using human shields. The psychological need to believe in a just world, where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, makes this attribution of blame particularly powerful. When we see someone suffering, it's psychologically easier to assume they must have done something to deserve it rather than confront the possibility that innocent people can be harmed by forces beyond their control. These mechanisms of moral disengagement don't operate in isolation, they work together in complex ways to create comprehensive justification systems for harmful behavior. A person might simultaneously minimize the harm they're causing, blame the victims for bringing it on themselves, claim they had no choice but to follow orders, and argue that their actions serve a higher purpose. Each mechanism reinforces the others, creating a psychological fortress that protects the person's positive self-image while allowing them to continue harmful behavior. The gradual nature of moral erosion makes it particularly difficult to recognize and resist. Research on what psychologists call the slippery slope effect shows that people who agree to small, seemingly harmless requests are more likely to agree to larger, more problematic requests later. Each compromise makes the next one easier to justify, creating a momentum toward increasingly harmful behavior. This principle was exploited systematically by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. Citizens weren't asked to participate in genocide immediately, they were first asked to accept minor restrictions on targeted groups, then, to avoid associating with them, then, to report suspicious behavior, and so on. Each step seemed reasonable given the previous one, until ordinary citizens found themselves complicit in mass murder. The role of situational factors in moral behavior cannot be overstated. The same person who might be honest in one situation can become corrupt in another, not because of any fundamental change in character, but because the environmental pressures and incentives have changed. This situational influence on moral behavior is both humbling and hopeful. Humbling because it suggests that none of us are immune to moral failure, but hopeful because it means that changing situations can promote moral behavior as well as undermine it. Understanding the architecture of moral collapse is essential for recognizing when we might be vulnerable to these psychological mechanisms in our own lives. By developing awareness of how moral disengagement operates, we can be more vigilant about the rationalizations we use to justify questionable behavior and more skeptical of authority figures who ask us to do things that feel wrong. This awareness must be coupled with practical strategies for maintaining moral clarity in challenging situations. This might involve seeking diverse perspectives on difficult decisions, creating accountability mechanisms that make it harder to engage in self-deception, and developing the habit of reflecting on the long-term consequences of our actions rather than just their immediate benefits. The goal is not to eliminate all moral flexibility. The ability to adapt our ethical reasoning to complex situations is sometimes necessary and appropriate. Rather, the goal is to ensure that this flexibility serves genuine moral purposes rather than merely protecting our self-image while we cause harm to others. Part 3: The Forging of Unbreakable Character. While the Lucifer effect reveals humanity's capacity for moral failure, it simultaneously illuminates the path toward moral excellence. The same psychological mechanisms that can lead ordinary people toward evil can be harnessed and redirected to cultivate extraordinary virtue. The difference lies not in the absence of challenge or temptation, but in the conscious choice to confront and overcome our weaker impulses through deliberate character development and moral strengthening. The ancient Stoic philosophers understood this principle deeply. They taught that true strength comes not from the absence of weakness, but from the systematic destruction of that weakness through rigorous self-examination and ethical discipline. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal that would become the Meditations, repeatedly emphasized the importance of destroying one's lesser self to become invulnerable to external corruption. The man who destroys his weak self, he wrote, can never be destroyed by others. This destruction of weakness is not a violent suppression of human nature, but rather a transformation of it. It involves replacing destructive patterns of thinking and behavior with constructive ones, gradually building a character so strong and well integrated that it becomes almost impossible to compromise. This process requires understanding the specific psychological vulnerabilities that make moral failure possible and, then, systematically addressing each one. The first step in this transformation involves developing what psychologists call moral awareness, the ability to recognize when situations contain ethical dimensions that require careful consideration. Many moral failures occur not because people consciously choose to do wrong, but because they fail to recognize the moral implications of their actions until it's too late. Cultivating moral awareness requires training ourselves to slow down and ask ethical questions even in situations that seem purely practical or technical. This awareness must be coupled with moral courage, the willingness to act on our ethical convictions even when doing so comes at personal cost. Moral courage is like physical courage in that it can be developed through practice and preparation. By deliberately placing ourselves in low-stakes situations where we can practice standing up for our principles, we build the psychological strength needed to maintain our integrity when the stakes are higher. The development of moral courage often requires confronting our deep-seated need for approval and belonging. Research consistently shows that fear of social rejection is one of the strongest predictors of moral compromise. People will often violate their own ethical standards rather than risk being excluded from their social group. Overcoming this tendency requires developing what might be called moral independence, the ability to act according to our principles even when others disapprove. This moral independence doesn't mean becoming antisocial or indifferent to others' opinions. Rather, it means developing a clear hierarchy of values where ethical principles take precedence over social approval. It means being willing to be disliked, criticized, or even ostracized rather than compromise our fundamental integrity. Building such strength requires understanding the difference between our essential self and our social persona. The social persona is the image we present to others, the roles we play, the impressions we try to create, the ways we adapt ourselves to fit social expectations. While this persona serves important functions, it becomes dangerous when it becomes more important to us than our authentic moral character. The process of destroying the weak self begins with honest self-assessment, identifying the specific fears, desires, and attachments that make us vulnerable to moral compromise. For some people, the primary vulnerability might be the need for approval; for others, it might be the desire for material success, the fear of conflict, or the addiction to comfort and convenience. Only by clearly identifying these weaknesses can we begin to address them systematically. This self-assessment must be ongoing and brutally honest. It's not enough to identify our weaknesses once and assume we've overcome them. The human psyche is remarkably adept at finding new ways to rationalize poor behavior, and what we think we've conquered may simply have found more subtle ways to influence our decisions. Regular self-examination, perhaps through journaling, meditation, or discussions with trusted advisors, is essential for maintaining moral clarity. The systematic strengthening of moral character involves both positive and negative practices. On the positive side, it means actively cultivating virtues like honesty, courage, justice, and compassion through deliberate practice. Just as physical strength is built through resistance training, moral strength is built through repeatedly choosing virtue in situations where vice would be easier or more immediately rewarding. On the negative side, it means deliberately exposing ourselves to the kinds of pressures and temptations that tend to compromise moral judgment, but in controlled circumstances where we can practice resistance. This might involve volunteering for difficult assignments where ethical dilemmas are likely, seeking feedback from people who will challenge our rationalizations, or placing ourselves in situations where we must choose between personal benefit and ethical behavior. The development of unbreakable character also requires building what might be called moral infrastructure, the systems, relationships, and practices that support ethical behavior even when our willpower is weak or our judgment is clouded. This infrastructure might include accountability partners who can challenge our decision-making, regular practices that reinforce our values, and clear personal policies that remove ambiguity from common ethical dilemmas. Creating this moral infrastructure often involves making commitments that constrain our future behavior in positive ways. A businessperson might establish clear policies about gift-giving and conflicts of interest before they face specific temptations. A politician might commit to transparency practices that make corruption more difficult. A professional might join organizations that enforce ethical standards and provide support for ethical decision-making. The role of community in character development cannot be underestimated. While moral independence is important, humans are inherently social beings, and our character is inevitably shaped by the people we surround ourselves with. Choosing to associate with people of strong moral character and distancing ourselves from those who normalize moral compromise is essential for maintaining our own ethical standards. This doesn't mean surrounding ourselves only with people who share our specific beliefs or opinions. Indeed, exposure to different perspectives can strengthen our moral reasoning by forcing us to examine and defend our principles. Rather, it means choosing to spend time with people who take ethics seriously, who are willing to challenge unethical behavior, and who model the kind of character we aspire to develop. The concept of destroying weakness also involves learning to find strength in what might initially appear to be limitations or difficulties. Physical disabilities can lead to extraordinary mental strength. Financial constraints can foster creativity and resourcefulness, social rejection can build independence and authenticity. Similarly, moral challenges and ethical dilemmas, rather than being obstacles to character development, can become the very means by which character is forged and strengthened. This reframing of difficulty as opportunity is crucial for developing anti-fragility in moral character, the ability not just to withstand moral challenges but to become stronger because of them. Every temptation successfully resisted, every difficult ethical decision navigated wisely, every compromise avoided despite pressure, becomes evidence of our capability and a foundation for future strength. The process of character forging also involves developing what might be called moral imagination, the ability to envision the long-term consequences of our actions and to see how our current choices connect to our ultimate goals and values. Many moral failures result from short-sighted thinking that prioritizes immediate benefits over long-term consequences. Developing the habit of asking, "What kind of person will I become if I make this choice?" can help maintain perspective during moments of temptation. This moral imagination must extend beyond personal consequences to include the impact of our actions on others and on society as a whole. The person of strong character doesn't just ask, "What's in it for me?" but also, "What kind of world am I creating through my choices?" This broader perspective can provide additional motivation for ethical behavior even when personal benefits are unclear. The ultimate goal of this character development is not perfection, which is impossible, but rather integration, the alignment of our deepest values with our daily actions. When this integration is achieved, ethical behavior becomes not a burden to be borne but a natural expression of who we are. Moral choices become easier not because the dilemmas are less complex, but because our character provides clear guidance about what is right. This integration creates what the ancients called virtue as its own reward, the recognition that moral behavior is inherently satisfying not just because of its external consequences but because it represents the authentic expression of our best self. The person who has destroyed their weak self and forged unbreakable character doesn't act ethically primarily to avoid punishment or gain rewards, but because ethical action has become an essential part of their identity. The development of such character is not a quick or easy process. It requires years of consistent effort, regular setbacks and recoveries, and the willingness to continuously challenge ourselves to grow beyond our current limitations. But the result, a character that cannot be broken by external pressure or corrupted by temptation, represents one of the highest achievements of human development. In a world where the Lucifer effect demonstrates how easily ordinary people can be led into evil, the cultivation of unbreakable character represents hope for humanity's potential for good. By understanding both our capacity for moral failure and our potential for moral excellence, we can make conscious choices to strengthen rather than weaken our ethical foundations. The man or woman who destroys their weak self through deliberate character development becomes not just immune to corruption but a source of moral strength for others facing their own ethical challenges. This transformation from vulnerability to strength, from moral weakness to unbreakable character, represents the highest calling of human development. It is the answer to the Lucifer effect, not the naive belief that good people will automatically do good things, but the mature recognition that goodness must be cultivated, strengthened, and protected through conscious effort and systematic development. Only by acknowledging our capacity for evil can we begin the work of ensuring our capacity for extraordinary good.